realm of death. Eldritch staggered forward, his boots pressing into the brittle and cracked ground. The air was thick with decay, the scent of long-dead things lingering in every breath. This was not a place meant for the living. Bones, hundreds, thousands of them, littered the landscape, half buried in the dry, ashen soil. The trees that remained were little more than skeletal husks, their twisted limbs reaching toward the perpetual twilight above. The sky was dark, choked in shifting clouds that seemed to whisper, their voices barely audible on the wind. Crimson Tear, the artifact Nocturna had given him, faded into nothing. Its glow extinguished. Eldritch clenched his fist. So it begins. He stood there, unsure of his next move. What now? Then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath him. He stepped back as a mass of blackened roots twisted and writhed, pulling themselves together, shaping into a figure, a man, aged but unbroken. His skin was pale, his veins dark like ink running through cracked porcelain. His eyes were deep pits of shadow, and his lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well," the old man said, his voice like dry leaves scraping over stone. "So, this is what Nocturna sends me? A man?" He scoffed. "No power of shadow, no primal strength, and certainly no connection to death. Why has he sent you?" Eldritch remained silent for a moment, measuring the strange ancient being before him. "I seek my freedom from Nocturna," Eldritch finally said, "so I agreed to the trials." At this, the old man threw back his head and laughed, a terrible, hollow sound that echoed across the barren expanse. His body seemed to fracture like dried stone, before reforming in an instant, as if the very act of amusement broke him apart. "Your freedom," he said mockingly. "Tell me, mortal, what do you intend to win with your feelings? No one has ever bested my realm. No one has even reached my champion. Yet here you stand, a mere man." His smirk deepened. "What did you do to upset Nocturna?" Eldritch narrowed his eyes. "Your realm?" The old man's expression became amused, yet almost pitying. "Of course, mortal. I am Necros. And this land," he gestured to the expanse of death around them, "is mine." Eldritch felt the weight of the revelation settle over him. He was standing in the realm of the god of death himself. Necros's smirk never faded as he continued. "So be it. Let the first trials begin." He mockingly tapped his chin as if in deep thought. "I'll even give you a fighting chance. Not that it will matter. There are 2 trials here in my domain. The first is simple." He pointed across the wasteland. "Cross my land, reach my metropolis of death. If you make it, which I doubt, you will face my champion of the undead. Should you somehow survive that, only then will you have completed my part of Nocturna's game." Necros stepped closer, his withered fingers hovering just above Eldritch's chest. "Let me be clear, mortal. No elder has ever made it. No lichen. No deathless one. Well," he tilted his head. "Actually, there was one." Eldritch's blood ran cold. Necros leaned in, whispering, "Should you make it to my city, you will understand." Then, without another word, his body dissolved into ash, scattering into the wind, leaving Eldritch alone in the wasteland of the dead. Eldritch exhaled sharply, staring ahead into the endless, forsaken land before him. Step 1. Survive. Eldritch looked out over the wasteland, in the direction Necros had pointed. His first steps toward freedom, his first steps toward survival. He took 1 step forward. The ground exploded. An endless sea of bodies erupted from the cracked earth, skeletal, rotting, yet still moving. Hundreds, then thousands. The wave of undead rose in unison, their hollowed-out sockets fixated on Eldritch. They stood still, waiting, like an army with no commander, yet bound by one will. A test A trial. A warning. Eldritch's breath caught in his throat. Impossible. His body tensed as he watched them, their grotesque forms standing shoulder to shoulder, stretching as far as the eye could see. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground. This cannot be done, he thought. Maybe with my shadow power I could slip through. Maybe as an elder I could fight them. But I have nothing. No power, no weapons, no strength. His hands gripped his head, fingers digging into his scalp. A heavy silence filled the land. The endless horde of death stood, unmoving, watching. Time stretched. For what seemed like an eternity, he remained there, kneeling on the ashen earth, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him. But then something snapped. A memory, a flicker of something far away, not of war, not of conquest, but of humanity. Eldritch lifted his head. "No," he said. His voice was quiet at first, but it built, growing like a flame. He pushed himself to his feet, the weight of doubt still clinging to him, but he would not let it break him. "I have walked this earth for nearly 1,200 years. I have seen the rise and fall of empires, witnessed kings build their thrones and die upon them. I have watched nations crumble and civilizations rebuild upon their ashes." His voice carried over the stillness, echoing through the dead land. "I have seen the power of fear, the disease of doubt, the paralysis of helplessness. It has stopped more men than any war. It has crushed more kingdoms than any battle." His eyes burned as he stared at the horde before him. "I know you. You can call yourself by many names. Fear, doubt, despair. But I have seen what you do, and I know one thing to be true." He stepped forward. "If I surrender to you, I have already failed." Another step. "Yes, I am afraid, but fear does not make me a coward. Fear is a test, a challenge, and I will win despite it." He took another step, then another, and another. The dead did not move, and so he kept walking. Eldritch walked forward, the ashen earth crunching beneath his boots. Before him, the endless horde of undead stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of decayed flesh and ancient bone, waiting for him to falter. Their empty sockets stared, their fingers twitched, their rotting bodies tensed. Yet Eldritch did not stop. As he strode forward, time folded upon itself. Memories of a king. The barren land flickered, and suddenly he was somewhere else. The sky was red with the fires of war. Rows upon rows of soldiers stood before him, their steel reflecting the dying sun. Their faces, young, hardened, loyal, awaited his words. Eldritch blinked. The vision wavered. Before him, the undead stood in place of the soldiers, their armour long rusted, their banners long forgotten, their flesh long rotted. But they had once been like the men he led. The two moments blurred together, past and present merging into one. Eldritch lifted his chin, his voice carrying across both time and reality. "I have lived longer than any of you." His voice was not a whisper, not a plea, but a command. In his mind, his soldiers of the past stood, waiting for his orders. Before him, the undead horde loomed, waiting for his weakness. "I have died more deaths than you will ever know. I have watched empires rise and fall. I have seen kings rule and crumble. I have walked this world, cursed, and I have seen the truth." Some of the undead stirred. You are not monsters. You are not mindless. You are warriors. Some of them straightened. A ripple passed through the horde. Do you remember your banners, your battles, the sound of steel upon steel? You do. You were soldiers, knights, lords, and I was like you. A flicker of recognition stirred within some of the undead. Echoes of old honour, fragments of forgotten loyalty, the presence of a true leader. Eldritch lifted his arms. Then tell me, do you follow a king, or do you follow fear? For the first time in 1,000 years, some of the undead hesitated. Their bones creaked as they stood taller. Some lowered their weapons. A path began to open through the horde, a path of death. Eldritch did not pause. He knew fear would undo his victory. He knew hesitation would kill him. So he walked. One step. The undead beside him stood still. Another step. The horde did not move. He passed between them, walking with the stride of a warlord, the stride of a king. In the distant past, he remembered marching through his own army. His men reached out to touch him as he passed. Their eyes burned with the fire of loyalty. They whispered his name. And now, in the present, the undead turned their heads as he walked. Their sunken eyes followed him. Some dropped their weapons. Others stood at attention, as if waiting for his next command. Eldritch did not look back. The dead had parted for him. And now his path was clear. From the shadows of the dead land, Necros observed. A smirk curled on his ancient lips. Fascinating, he murmured. A man who does not conquer through steel, but through will. He leaned forward. But will he conquer my champion? The next challenge awaited. Eldritch stood at the edge of oblivion. The path of parted undead warriors had ended, and before him stood a different kind of death. These were not soldiers. These were not men who once knew honour. These were hollow things, stripped of memory and identity. They existed only to destroy. There were too many. Eldritch did not falter. He had faced death before. He had led men into unwinnable battles. He had stood against impossible odds. Now he must do so again. He took a breath, steady, deep. His fingers curled into fists. His mind prepared for his final stand. If he must die, let it be as a king. A thud beside him. The ground trembled as a tattered banner pierced the earth. Eldritch turned. An undead warrior, his body a ruin of bone and rusted armour, stood beside him. His hands clutched the banner of a long-dead kingdom. His hollow eyes stared forward, unblinking. Then another banner struck the ground. Then another. The undead warriors who had parted for Eldritch had not left him. They had followed. They had watched. And now they had chosen to stand with him. For centuries they had wandered this forsaken land without purpose. Eldritch had given them one. He had reminded them of the king they once followed. He had stirred the echoes of honour long buried beneath rot and time. Now they would stand with him one last time. A bony, withered hand rested on Eldritch's shoulder. An ancient warrior, his armour fused with rust, held out a sword. Rusted, bent, scarred with age. But Eldritch recognised it. This was a king's sword. He took it, and as the weight settled into his grip, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. Loyalty. The battle of the damned. Eldritch raised his sword high. The warriors behind him clutched their weapons. The banners of ancient nations fluttered in the still air. The hollow undead stirred. Eldritch pointed his sword towards the enemy. Forgotten or not, a king still leads his army. And then they charged. The undead legions of hollow death rushed forward. The resurrected warriors of ages past met them with steel and defiance, the clash of rusted swords, the roar of warriors who had not shouted in an eternity, the sound of metal biting bone, of bodies falling, of war unleashed. Eldritch did not command from the rear. He led from the front. His sword moved with precision, not power. He dodged instead of blocked. He struck only when necessary, moving faster than the mindless creatures could react. For every warrior that fell, 2 more rose in his place. This was not just a battle of survival. This was a battle of defiance. The forgotten warriors had been given a purpose, and for one final time, they would fight for something more than just existence. Through the carnage, Eldritch fought as he had in life, as a leader, as a king, and the dead followed. High above the battlefield, beyond sight, beyond time, Necros watched. A god of death, seated upon an unseen throne, gazed down at the clash of warriors long forgotten, a game played out upon a field of bones and dust, a game of kings, though only one king remained. His skeletal fingers drummed idly against the armrest of his throne. His hollow eyes, pits of endless black, reflected the battlefield below. Eldritch fought like a king of old, precise, calculated, relentless. But it wasn't just skill. No, it was the power of words, of leadership, of commanding loyalty, even from the damned. Fascinating. Necros had seen thousands, millions pass through his realm, each one falling to despair, each one breaking beneath the weight of death. But Eldritch, he had done what no elder, no vampire, no undead tyrant of old had done before. He had made death itself listen. Necros lifted a hand, twisting his fingers in the empty air. The warriors fighting at Eldritch's side. He had given them just a little push, a whisper, a nudge, a reminder of who they once were. After all, what fun is a game if the pieces move too predictably? He leaned forward, watching Eldritch carve his way through the battlefield, a man among monsters. "You intrigue me, mortal," Necros murmured to himself. "You have the makings of something far greater than you realize." Then he smiled, because Eldritch's greatest test was yet to come. Necros shifted his gaze away from the battlefield, turning towards the darkness beyond, a place that even the dead feared to tread. The silence there was unnatural, not empty, just waiting. Necros mused, tapping a finger against his throne. "It seems the time has come to awaken the past." His voice carried through the abyss, a whisper that rippled across the land of the dead. Not a command, not an order, a summoning. Somewhere, far from the battlefield, in a realm untouched by decay, a candle flickered. A figure looked up. Their fingers, once idle, tightened around the hand of a woman. Her presence beside them was the only warmth in this forsaken realm. She met their gaze. Lily. She knew before they spoke. "Necros is calling." She held their hand tighter. "Don't go." A pause. "I have no choice." Because long ago, a promise was made. A promise that had allowed them to stay here, in this pocket of death untouched by suffering. A promise that had spared them from an eternity of torment. And now, the debt was due. Necros smiled. "Yeah, Eldritch, you have impressed me." He leaned back in his throne, watching as the battle below neared its end. "But I wonder, will you impress them?" He snapped his fingers. Somewhere in the depths of the afterlife, something stirred. The clash of steel filled the ashen air. Eldritch fought like a man possessed, his blade carving through the relentless tide of the undead. He did not fight for survival. He fought as a king who refused to kneel. But still, they kept coming. The warriors beside him, his warriors, fell one by one, dragged into the abyss by the merciless horde. A skeletal hand clawed at his arm. He severed it. A decaying face lunged at his throat. He crushed it beneath his boot, but it wasn't enough. He turned, searching for his allies, his army, and what he saw was the past. Smoke, blood, the dying screams of his men. Another time, another war. He stood in the heart of a battlefield, a nobleman turned general, his forces crumbling before an overwhelming enemy. His warriors and his brothers fought with everything they had, but they were losing, dying. A banner, the sigil of his house, lay discarded in the mud. Eldritch's heart pounded. He had seen this before. Then, and now, the past and present bled together. He watched his warriors fall in 2 times, in 2 lives, in 2 battles. And then he moved. Eldritch dropped his sword. Instead, he reached down, grasping the fallen banner. The fabric was stained with blood. Its sigil, once feared, once honoured, had been trampled into the dirt. He lifted it high. "Stand with me!" His voice roared across both battlefields. His undead warriors, his army of fallen kings and knights, turned to him. So did the soldiers from his past, in a battle long forgotten. In both lives, his warriors looked upon him as a leader, and in both lives they listened. "You fight as men who have already accepted defeat," Eldritch's voice thundered, carrying across both battlefields. "Look at them. Look at the ones who would stand in our way. They are nothing but fear given shape. They are doubt made flesh, and they would see us bow before them." He thrust the banner higher. "No, we do not bow. We do not break. We are warriors, kings and conquerors. We are the ones who decide our fate." The undead warriors at his side stirred. Deep within them, the echoes of their past lives. Their forgotten honor, their lost pride, began to stir. Eldritch's eyes blazed with fury. "The question is not if they will let us pass." He lowered the banner, pointing it forward. "But how will they stop us?" A roar erupted from his warriors across both battlefields. In his past life and in the land of Necros, his soldiers rose and they charged. The battlefield shifted. Where once they had been overwhelmed, now they carved through the enemy lines. Eldritch fought at the front, leading from the front. Always, the undead warriors, once hesitant, now struck with renewed strength, pushing forward like an unstoppable tide. Even the undead who opposed him hesitated. They did not understand why. Why did this one mortal command such loyalty? Why did the warriors of old listen to him, follow him? Eldritch knew the answer. Because he was a king. Even in death, a king commands. And even the dead remember how to kneel. Above them, Necros watched. A dark amusement flickered across his decayed face. The tide had turned, just as he had hoped. A skeletal hand extended from the darkness, fingers curling ever so slightly. A whisper, a suggestion, a nudge. He gave Eldritch's warriors just a little push. Not enough to be obvious, Not enough to make it easy, just enough to ensure Eldritch would reach the end of this game. After all, Necros was eager for what came next. Eldritch walked forward, alone. Behind him, silence. No enemy pursued, no warrior followed. He turned, looking back one final time. There they stood, the warriors of old, the undead who had answered his call. For centuries, they had been trapped in this abyss, robbed of their honor, stripped of their purpose. But on this day, for the briefest moment, they had been warriors again. Eldritch raised the banner high, a salute, a tribute, a final act of respect. One by one they began to fall, not in defeat, but in release. They crumbled into ash, fading into the darkness from which they had been trapped. His closest warriors, those who had stood at his side, held out a little longer. Eldritch looked at them, and though their faces were skeletal, hollow, he could still see it in them. Thanks. A warrior's soul does not forget. And then they too were gone. Crimson Tear shone with a brilliant glow, but he did not vanish. Not yet. This was the sign. The first trial was complete. He turned back toward the doors of the undead metropolis. The colossal iron gates groaned, then slowly creaked open. Beyond them, darkness. Eldritch stepped forward. The halls of the metropolis were cold and endless. His footsteps echoed through the abandoned city of the dead. Great stone statues loomed over him, depicting kings and warriors long forgotten. Carvings on the walls told stories of those who had passed through this place, only to be swallowed by it. But still, he walked, and then he reached it. A cavernous hall, vast and empty, an arena. Eldritch felt the presence before he saw him. A figure stood at the far end. Slowly, the man began to walk forward. There was nothing unusual about him. No dark aura, no supernatural presence. Just a man. But as he drew closer, Eldritch recognized something in his eyes. Power, knowledge, experience. This was no ordinary opponent. The man stopped a few paces away, meeting Eldritch's gaze. Then he spoke. I am Edgar Thornwood. I stand as Necros champion. His voice was calm, certain. I will not lose. Then his face began to change. The flesh tightened, blackened. His eyes became hollow pits of darkness. He raised his arms. The ground trembled. From the shadows behind him, something began to rise. A monstrous entity, neither living nor dead. A creature of living death. Crimson Tear flickered. Eldritch exhaled. His second trial was clear. Defeat the most powerful necromancer of all time. To be continued.